Hi, it's Andrea Edwards. Welcome back. This is part 2 of We Need a New Middle Class Dream, section 4, where we're going to be talking about white goods, something all of us have, right? Well, those of us lucky enough to have it. Anyway, I just want to remind you why I'm doing this. What we have is a scale issue, and we need to address that. We can't keep growing the way we are growing. We need a new middle class dream. So lots of different ideas for all the different sectors. And I think I've got about 5 more to go through, and then I'll move on to the conclusions. So to everyone watching, thank you. I appreciate it. I appreciate you taking the time, and I hope it's valuable. All right, shall we get stuck in? Alrighty, white goods. So when I visit my friends and family in Australia, it's not uncommon to see 4 or 5 or even more fridges and freezers in their homes. It's a hot country, and Aussies certainly like their drinks cold, but it's also about how our cities and towns were designed, especially over the last 50 or so years. The urban sprawl, where you have to travel a distance to a supermarket to buy goods versus what we used to do when I was growing up, and that was walking down to the local shops to buy the basics that you needed. Of course, you needed to go to the supermarket once a week, but you could get your basics, right? So I grew up with local shops. We had the local shop called Pat's Shop. We used to rock his roof, which was good fun as kids. But they started shutting down years ago, and the original shop, Pat's Shop, is now a cafe because it's just next to the hospital. So how we shop has changed, which means that more fridge space is required as we shop less, but we buy more every time we go, especially in Western countries. So just as one example, globally, we have 1.4 billion domestic refrigerators and freezers in the worldwide, and the growth predictions are going only in one direction, and that's up. In fact, the market growth just for fridges is off the charts. Everyone, of course, especially the 3.8 billion middle-class people, potentially have a washing machine, a dryer, and depending on where you live, air conditioning. Guess what? Sales for all white goods are going up dramatically because when you're middle class, you can afford this stuff. But it's not just the middle class, as I'll show you shortly. So what does the data for the white goods market look like? Okay. Well, I'm glad you asked. It was valued at $661 billion in 2021, and it's projected to grow to 1,343 billion by 2030. That's 103% growth, which of course is another example of doubling. What is defined as a white good, and I always find it's important to research the words you use so you know that you're using the right words in the right context. And I found it a really interesting question to ask, seeing what popped up. So we obviously have the major appliances, which most people consider white goods, but we also have smaller appliances and, of course, consumer electronics, which I'm going to cover in the e-waste section. When it comes to major appliances, we've got air conditioners, fridges, microwaves, washing machines, and all of these other things. For smaller appliances, we've got juicers, coffee grinders, kettles, waffle irons. God, we've got so much stuff, haven't we? Coffee makers, blenders, rice cookers, you name it. And then, of course, we've got the third category, which is the consumer electronics, which I said I'll discuss when we talk about the technology in the e-waste section. What's the life cycle for our product today? As you can see, from low quality to high quality, it then comes up with the average. So a low quality, just as an example, electric dryer typically lasts for 11 years, a high quality one for 18 years, and that averages out at 14 years. But once it's done, what's next for the dryer? Microwaves, low quality, it's only 5 years, high quality, 10 years, and that averages out at 8 years. I remember the first microwave my family bought in the 80s, and that was a big investment for my family back then. But it was still going 20 years later. It wasn't going well, but it was still going. I can't even imagine the amount of microwaves that would have been oozing out of it. But again, what's next for these products at their end of life? The dump? That's basically where they're going. We have a linear process for our products. So what this means is we mine the earth, for the materials and the minerals and everything that we need. We make products like white goods. We buy them and use them for less time than we did even a couple of decades ago. And then we dump them in the environment. The new machine that we might replace it with follows the same path. So all of the valuable materials in our products do not go back into making new products, which is the issue. So that's why we desperately need a circular economy where everything that can be reused is reused versus digging up more materials from the earth and creating even more environmental destruction. So we've all got to really push for this circular economy. We've got to force the brands that we buy from to move in this direction as quickly as possible. Nothing should be going into the dump, into the environment where it breaks down and creates problems for all of us, as well as all life on Earth. We've also got to stop being cheap, and that's an issue. People love a bargain, right? And that's the other side. This doesn't factor in upgrading our products when we don't need to. As an example, I remember watching TV coverage on one of the annual mega US sales event, and it featured a guy being interviewed saying he's going to buy a new TV, even though he doesn't need one, but he just really wants one and can't resist because it's so cheap. Some friends of mine in the UK know a couple. They don't have any children. So every couple of years, they rip out their entire house and completely replace everything in the house, with most of what they rip up going to the dump. I mean, that sort of behavior, just because you can afford it, that's not really the way you should be behaving based on where we are as a society and the state of our environment. But all of this stuff, it really speaks volumes to me about the real problems, the fundamental problems that we have in our society, and that disconnect about the impact that we're making based on our own decisions. Getting a deal is everything these days, but we are not considering what that deal is actually costing the planet because we're not paying for that. We never have paid for that. So using our white goods for the long term, fixing them when they get broken. And if you don't have the infrastructure in place where that's easy to do, we need to get it in place right across the world. And we should only be upgrading when it's necessary. You know, we've got to start thinking about our decisions and the impact it's having on the environment and the future that we're leaving for our children and our grandchildren. We also need to buy the best quality that we can afford, and we should be starting to support the brands that are really pushing to create the circular economy for their products, and of course, products that are also earth-friendly. But remember, green growth is still growth, and growth is the issue. I know this is a pretty ugly representation of data, but let's compare white good uptake in this list of countries. So first is cookers or ovens. And as you can see, home ownership of cookers or ovens is 47% in China, 50% in Japan, and only 36% in South Korea. If you've ever been to Asia or live in Asia, you know food centers or hawker centers, which they're also called, are the center of daily life, and they're at the base of where most people live. So it's very easy to eat your meals in these community centers rather than cooking at home. And this is one of these ways of life that we could be really looking to expand globally to reduce our impact, and maybe we'll be able to improve community connectedness as an added bonus, which is something that we need to be doing anyway. More local eating establishments for the community are critical versus the Western style cities where everything is a drive away. For a high percentage of cookers, countries over 90% include Argentina at 92%, Brazil at 91%, and Spain at 90%. But I was amazed to see the US at only 72%. For a rich country, that was certainly something that did surprise me. When it comes to dishwashers, Turkey is at 90%, and the next closest is Sweden at 68% and Italy at 64%. Standalone freezers are mostly under 50%, apart from Sweden, which is at 65%. Microwaves are ubiquitous, apart from India, which is the only country in this list under 50%. Refrigerators are ubiquitous everywhere, as we can see. And for vacuum cleaners, we have only 5 countries represented under 50%, and they are Argentina, China, India, Mexico, and South Africa. If every item here reaches 90% or so in all of these countries, what's the impact? Especially as there is no circular economy for white goods. Remember, between China and India, there are approximately 2.8 billion people. So this is something we must be thinking about. It doesn't mean they can't have these items. It means we need to reinvent how we all have these items. As I've said all along, scale is the issue, and I wanted to show you how it really looks by showing you this data. But let's focus on the white good of the moment, especially for any country going through heat extremes, and that's, of course, air conditioners. If you can't cool yourself down in wet bulb temperatures, you can die from heat stroke. And this is a very high risk for outdoor workers like farmers, those working in the construction industry, the travel and tourism industry, and so on. There's lots of them. Even though they can't afford it, did you know that 1.2 billion people who are currently living in rural environments, so they are not middle class, are looking to buy their very first air conditioners? They definitely need it, no question about that. But what will the impact of that surge in consumption be? Is the industry thinking about it? Are governments? And if they are, what ideas are they putting in place to keep their people safe? Like cooling centres in communities across the global south, or natural cooling structures made of bamboo or clay with water. You know, there are natural, sustainable solutions that don't require any energy, but we're not really seeing that happening at scale, especially in the global south. And this is really, really important. Here's the projected growth of just air conditioners, nearly tripling between now and 2050. And of course, China and India are in the lead for investing in air conditioning units. China, India, and many, many other countries in the global south have been experiencing devastating heat impacts in the last few years, but a challenge exists. The vast majority being purchased are cheaper models, which release even more emissions. So we need to convince the manufacturers to get these off the market, and we also need to work out more effective cooling techniques for communities, and we need to do it fast. The more expensive and sustainable units also need to be more widely available and affordable. The climate is becoming warmer and more humid, and controlling indoor humidity through air conditioning technologies impacts the environment in 3 ways. 1, it consumes a considerable amount of electricity, often run off coal, especially in the developing world. Fossil fuels are at the core of the global south for all energy needs. Number 2, air conditioners use and leak CFC, which is chlorofluorocarbons, CFC-based refrigerants with global warming potential that is 2,000 times as potent as carbon dioxide. And number 3, the manufacturing and delivery of these systems also release greenhouse gases. I have to ask, does this sound like the ultimate definition of irony? We're heating our world dramatically, which means people need to work out how to stay cool to survive, which will mean we keep increasing the heat in the world. We've really got to think this through and work out a way to solve this enormous challenge. Otherwise, huge numbers of people will die from heat extremes, or huge numbers of people will be on the move. Both are extremely bad for humanity and for world peace. The increasing need to cool the air in our built environment is both a cause and an effect of climate change. Air conditioning accounts for a large portion of global greenhouse gas emissions today, which is estimated at 3.9%, so it's around about the aviation industry. However, the role that humidity plays in these emissions is often overlooked. Emissions associated with reducing air humidity, which is about removing water vapor from the air, are larger than emissions associated with reducing air temperature, which is cooling the air, right? So what are our options here? And all of this, everything that I'm sharing, everything needs a massive rethink, but let's have a look just from a white goods perspective. So number one, we have to get cheap white goods off the market and call it what it is, ecocide. Ecocide is the destruction of the environment. And when it comes to this manufacturing sector, many of its products fit in this category. In fact, practically every industry is practicing some form of ecocide. And now that more and more countries are making ecocide part of their law, this is something that obviously businesses need to get on top of. Number two, manufacturers must drop prices for sustainable products because shareholder return is not good for the planet. The cheapest products release the most emissions and are so poorly made, which means it needs to be replaced in a shorter time frame. This is a classic example of our economy being destructive for our environment. The manufacturers of white goods are not making the best products that last a long time because they wouldn't be able to grow year on year if they did that. You don't need to replace something if it keeps working, right? And that's basically about pleasing their shareholders because they're going to get returns year after year, which is the whole purpose of it. So it's in the business interest to create the cheapest, nastiest products because it's good for business. We must revamp our global economy to be in alignment with a healthy planet. And if you really understand what I'm saying here, it means a total revolution is required of our global economy. And honestly, we're not really even having this conversation yet. Number three, we have to buy higher quality. And I know that this is hard for so many people. The rural farmers who are buying their first air conditioner, they can't afford to buy the best product. They just can't. So they'll be scraping and saving to get the best that they can. But we also need to repair what we have. And any machines that are made today need to be made to last. Washing machines, there's lots of different figures about it, and I just shared some earlier, but washing machines used to last 10 years or more. Now it's 6 or even 2 if it's really cheap. Where does all the waste from the machines go? Fridges, 10 years for a standard model, 20 years for a high-end model, and a couple of years for a low-end model. What lasts 10 to 15 years today used to last 19 years in the early 90s. Now, upgrading isn't always a bad thing because it means the machine works better and is more energy efficient, but it's the waste from the discarded items that needs to be addressed. We dump old white goods and we should return them to the manufacturer to create a circular economy. So please, if you're getting rid of a fridge, don't take it to the tip. Leave it at the front gate of the brand that is responsible for the fridge, and let's force the circular economy. But we've got to be part of it, and we've got to get everything that we can back to the manufacturers. Everything created needs to have a next place, next use, or it shouldn't be allowed to exist. Number 4, we need sustainable cooling in regions impacted by extreme heat. And this is a really critical need to address, especially with what is going on right now as the Global South enters its hot season. Just this week, it was announced that Phoenix, Arizona in the US recorded 645 deaths related to high temperatures in 2023. The number of heat-related deaths was more than 50% higher than 2022. This is a modern Western city. We're currently looking at heat waves across Asia, Africa, Latin America, Australia, and beyond. And we may never know the number of heat-related deaths. I'm sitting in Thailand, and the wet bulb temperature has regularly hit 30 to 43 degrees Celsius in recent weeks. For those living without cooling, this is a disaster unfolding. especially as peak heat won't happen until April and May. How hot is it going to get? And we may never know how many people die in these heat extremes. But one thing for sure, the wildlife is already impacted, as my friends are telling me they are seeing dead birds and insects all the time now. As a personal experience, I can say it's extremely uncomfortable living in this intense heat week after week, and we have air conditioning. Well, for now we do. I'm hoping the grid stays up. All right, number 5, we need to look at energy-free solutions, and a great place to start is to get inspiration from our ancestors. In the Middle East, they have ancient cooling towers that do an amazing job. In Asia, we have Peranakan architecture, which is all about natural air circulation. A lot of those natural features have been blocked and sealed up. And if you walk through these areas on a hot day, it's absolutely stifling. Number 6, we need to invest in the Global South's infrastructure, which is even more critical because coal dominates energy production. And this is something that impacts us all. Many people are not thinking about global issues when it comes to the emergency we face. They think it's happening over there, but nothing's over there. We're all at the mercy of this beast. But the truth is, if we don't invest in the countries in the Global South, we all suffer the consequences. More than half of humanity live in this region, and there are many wealthy countries as well as many poor. From Latin America to Africa, Asia, including China, Japan, and South Korea, the Indian subcontinent, down to Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands, and more, right? The infrastructure is relatively poor in the vast majority of these countries. This includes energy generation, which is typically run by coal or gas, at least in some countries. In Thailand, it's predominantly gas. But if we don't invest in sustainable energy in these countries, especially countries like India, then we are all going to suffer as the planet gets hotter. This is a critical issue. We've got to address it. By the way, I keep using the word Global South, and I know that it's a term that many people don't like, but we're not talking about the Southern Hemisphere. I'm in the Northern Hemisphere here in Thailand, right? So I don't know any other word that sort of encapsulates this entire region. So if you have a better suggestion, please let me know. All right, and the final one, number 7, we need to understand the impact of growth, and we're not looking this in the eye. Throughout this series I'm doing, I'm attempting to illustrate the scale of growth, and that's not something I see many people talk about, which is why I decided to do this series and why I think this information is important. Every single industry is growing exponentially, especially when you look at growth over the longer term, which is what I've been doing. And the impact of the growth does not appear to be a priority for business leaders or governments. As I said, it's time to look this in the eye, and then we've got to get the industries like the manufacturers of white goods to come together and work out how to move forward in alignment with living in the 9 planetary boundaries. The way we operate currently with the share market and delivering shareholder value, that's something that we've got to say it's not going to be around for much longer, one way or another. All right. So what are some of the things that we can do, you and I? And you'll start to see some overlap in some of these ideas, but it's definitely time for all of us to start asking ourselves some serious questions, like how can we come together and share resources? For example, laundry rooms in apartment buildings and in communities, so let's say when I talked about cars, I talked about ripping up the roads in residential areas. Maybe we could be building little structures on these streets where they have a central sort of laundromat for the street to use. How can we do this? How can we share it? And what are the tools that we only use, a couple of times a year? Do we all need to buy them? There's things like tool libraries. If we set up the laundromat in the local residential area, maybe we can stock it full of tools that the whole community needs and share. The sharing economy is a big part of where we need to go in the future. Number two, we need to start applying the basics to keep our homes cool. And so much of this stuff is not expensive and everyone can be doing it. Painting our roofs white, simple. Most highly reflective paint you can get it and slap it on and lay it on thick. We've got to green up our lived environments. If we're sitting here in an extreme heat event, plant bamboo, it grows unbelievably fast, and then you're going to have some natural shade. We've got to make sure that we have the highest quality insulation, including on our windows. When the heat extremes start, grid pressure really starts to mount up very, very quickly. Let's all dedicate a small room in our family homes for the hot days, and we can all stay there and keep cool, which means that we can guarantee that the grid holds for everybody in the community rather than all of us losing it because we're trying to air condition a 4 or 5 bedroom home. So we've got to be thinking about those sort of things. Grid independence is a really, really important thing, especially if the energy grid goes down. And once we start getting up around 50 degrees Celsius, that is definitely a likelihood. We've seen it happen in roads in Greece. Their energy grid fell over, and it was somewhere between 48.5 and 49.5 degrees Celsius. And the interesting thing is their grid is below ground. In much of the developing world, the electricity is still above ground, so it's even more vulnerable to grid failures. I've written a few blogs on this topic, and I'll include one of the blogs in the notes below if you want to look at some ideas for how you can do some basic things in your home environment. It goes all the way through to what we need to be considering as societies, what our governments should be doing, our healthcare, you name it, I've included it. Number three, community cooling stations will be critical in the coming years as our world heats up with deadly wet bulb temperatures on the rise, and it will get hotter and last longer as the weather continues to change. How do we ensure all countries can provide shelters for people impacted by these heat extremes? How do we also make sure it's available 24/7? In the US, a lot of people were kicked out at 5 p.m. when things like libraries had to close. So then they were out in the heat in the night where it's really difficult to sleep. So this is not a long-term solution, but we can look at getting people through the worst of it now as we plan for long-term adaptation. And migration needs to be part of that conversation. Places will become too hot to live, and we need to get ready for that and what that means. In wealthy countries and poor, the people with the least, who contributed the least to the problem, they need our help. How can we help them make their homes heat resistant? Can we establish cooling stations in all environments so they have easy access if the grid falls over? Can we invest in alternative energy sources so they can have grid independence? Can we get people off generators? Especially in Africa, this is a big thing. They create enormous amounts of pollution, but equally, in extreme heat events, the generators will start to fail. Could go on and on here, but we've got to help the poorest. It breaks my heart watching the people who are suffering this every single day. They're not the ones that created this problem, but they're certainly at the front lines facing the worst of it. Number four, heat extremes buckle the healthcare system, as we've seen in wealthy countries like the US. It makes fighting fires more difficult because of the impact of extreme heat on the firefighters and their equipment. And we must ensure our police officers can keep their communities safe as extremes hit. We need to get our governments focused on what we need to do to get ready wherever we are in the world. One example, which is continuing on the fire risks, across the tropical parts of the world, the investment in fire capabilities is for a world that rarely burns. It's tropics, it's always green. I saw my first drought in Asia back at the beginning of the 10s, and it really shocked me. I grew up in drought, I grew up in Australia, but it really shocked me to see the tropics in drought. And so as I look out the window and see all of the brown trees around us and the brown grass, it's very brown in the tropics right now because it's been so hot. I wonder if the firefighting capabilities that currently exist could handle a big fire. They haven't been set up for that. Even countries like Australia, which are experienced with fire, are not ready for the fires that are on the horizon. And number six, What can we do for our wildlife? My friend Vicky Coburn, hi Vicky, she always listens into these, and thank you, told me she's heard of birds and animals and insects being found dead in large numbers here in Thailand. If we survive the heat extremes, but nature doesn't, how can humanity continue to survive? This is a real risk, and I'm not seeing the education and awareness of what we can do to support nature. Let's all commit to doing what we can for the natural world during these extremes. So make sure you leave out water for the birds and the insects. Water with honey in it is great for bees and for their energy. Just go and have a look at what you can do if you're passionate about elephants. How do we protect them once the wet bulb temperatures keep going up? Are they all going to die? The insects is probably the thing that worries me the most, because they're the core of the ecosystem, and they think already in the tropics that there is a catastrophic collapse happening to insect numbers. If we lose the insects, how do we survive? After last year's heat extremes, when the geckos and the insects and the birds came back at the end of it, I got to tell you, I was unbelievably relieved. I wasn't expecting it. I thought I would see a real diminishment in their numbers. But we recently had some birds who come every year to nest, and they started setting up their nests, and I haven't seen them since. So I don't know what's going on there. They might have died in the heat. There's a second nesting season that comes up just after the hot season. So I hope we're not seeing the beginning of this. It's one of these things that I think about a lot, and it makes me really, really sad. All right, that's another one. And next, I'm going to be talking about the fast-moving consumer goods market, or FMCG. And we're also going to talk about pets, which I think will be my most unpopular topic so far. I have pets. I understand. I love them too. But we've got to look this situation in the eye, right? And pets are part of the global consumption numbers. So what are we going to do about that? Please follow me on social media. You can see where I am here, or come and join the Facebook group, 1 Billion People with Uncommon Courage. And let's come together to create a global community committed to driving action. 1 billion people acting and driving change can create the human tipping point we need. Once we reach 1 billion people, we only need each person to recruit 3 to 4 other people, and then we're going to have enough people to be in a position to drive the runaway changes required. We also have to believe we can do it, and then we all need to get to work. There's 5 more of these before I move on to the final conclusion. So FMCG next, and pets. Then we're going to look at the war industry, e-waste, travel and tourism, and the waste crisis. After that, I'm going to get stuck into the conclusion. All right, so thanks for joining me. I really, really appreciate it. If you haven't subscribed to my YouTube channel, I'd really appreciate it if you did. I don't seem to be too successful at building numbers on these sort of channels, but anyway, I keep going. So yeah, I'd appreciate it if you gave me a follow. All right, cheers guys. See you soon.